the facets, FAS. The ligand is secreted, but FAS is a transmembrane receptor that's in the what did I just say? In the tumor necrosis factor receptor family. And as far as I can tell, I don't know the truth in this. Somebody on the line says it stands for first apoptosis substance or something. I don't know if that's true or not. But it turns out that Facil, when it binds to the receptor, it causes apoptosis. Or okay, I read it on some like blog that looked like high school students. I wasn't sure. Not that I'm disrespecting a high school student. But for 20 years I've been trying to find it. So I got a confirmation. It says what? First apoptosis stimulator or something like that. But so what this thing does is estrogen then is not only decreasing rankle, which would normally stimulate the osteoclast. It's also, you're shaking your head like you don't like it. It's also increasing osteoprotegrin, which ties up the rankle that would be stimulating the osteoclast. And it's releasing this facil, which we think stands for first apoptosis stimulator or something like that. So this facil then is causing the osteoclast to undergo apoptosis or programmed cell death. But there's more. Yeah?
I actually have two questions. The first question is, what would be the benefit of having a false receptor versus like a binding globulin or a binding protein that binds up the hormone?
Well, it's kind of doing the same thing. That's kind of what it's doing. So it's effectively acting as a binding protein, but it's a soluble receptor that binds up the rankle. So effectively, it's acting like a binding protein and decreasing its ability to stimulate the osteoclast.
Okay. And then is there any second messenger system at all associated with the false receptor?
No, I think the main thing it's doing is tying it up so that it can't get to the real rank.
Okay.
So once it's tied up and bound to this osteoprotegrin, it's no longer able to get access to the rank, the real receptor. So it's no second messenger. It's literally just tying it up. Okay, then it does one other thing. Oh, this is going to be hard for me to remember. I'm sure somebody knows this. It binds to osteoclast, and it stimulates an enzyme called capspase, which stands for cysteine dependent aspartate something driven, directed protease. Oh, maybe that's supposed to be an S. So it stimulates in the osteoclast this caspase enzyme, and this enzyme is associated with accelerated apoptosis. So in the presence of estrogen, your bone is protected in all these ways. There's a decrease in rankle, so the osteoblasts aren't stimulating the osteoclast as much. There's an increase in osteoprotegrin, OPT, so that what rankle is there is not as effective. There's an increase in facil, so that and actually it's not the osteoclast. Facil stimulates the pre-osteoclast to undergo apoptosis faster. So you don't have as much osteoclast available in the first place. So it's the developing osteoclasts that undergo early apoptosis. And it's stimulating the osteoclasts that are already there to undergo apoptosis, so there's less osteoclast to spit acid and bring the calcium out. We're good? Questions or comments? So one of the problems you can see, as we'll have time to start talking about today, is that when you hit menopause at about 40 to 50, and your estrogen levels go down, you're losing all these benefits of estradiol. So it allows the osteoclast to have an upper hand. There's less rankle. I don't know why I keep messing it up. There's less rankle coming from the osteoblast, or more rankle if your estrogen's down, coming from the osteoblast. There's less osteoprotegrin, there's less facil, and the osteoclasts aren't dying as fast because caspase is not being induced by the estrogen. Yeah.
Is the decrease in wrinkle secretion by the osteoblast really slow so that you need the osteocontractor? Or I'm just kind of
I don't know if it's a matter of slow, it's just two, let's see, what would be a good analogy of confusion? I think it's just two different ways to actually keep the balance between osteoblast and osteoclast.
So if something went wrong with your osteocontractor, would you see the same response?
What do you mean the same result?
So
You would see,
with the-
I guess you would see a net bone loss. Because all of these things are there to sort of keep the balance, so to speak. Okay? But, again, estrogen is important, but it's not on the calciostat because it's not regulated by calcium. Even though estradiol is critical, your ovaries, or your testes, and your bone, have no idea how much calcium there is. But that background level of estrogen is important for all of those reasons. We're good? So what you should start thinking about is how to integrate not only all of the stats, right? But also how to integrate those things with all of the axes that we talked about. So the reproductive axis becomes important in bone growth for a couple reasons. Sorry, this is a simplified version. One is for long bone growth. Remember that either estradiol or androgens converted into estrogen stimulate your growth spurt. That's for long bone growth. And at the same time, at adrenarche or in puberty, that you start to experience linear growth of the bone, that same estradiol or androgen converted to estrogen in the bone is necessary for maintaining the strength of that bone because of its effects on calcium deposit in the bone. Precipitation of calcium in bone. Does that make sense? The other thing that's important for estradiol is that after you reach puberty, it's E2, it's estrogen, that stimulates the calcification of the growth plates so that you stop growing. And you can literally, I saw my daughters when she went to get her ankle MRI or whatever it's called. You literally see like a little line there where it starts to seal, you see it?
Yeah.
Where it starts to seal over. So it's literally like a little line. And the doctor can say, oh, yep, she's done growing. She won't get any problem. So while estradiol stimulates long bone growth, the linear growth, while it's stimulating long bone growth and supporting the osteoblasts for girth and calcium deposit in the bone, it also shuts off the growth. Eventually causes the growth plates to fuse, to be calcified in the long bones. Again, your hands and your face stay. I don't think they ever close up, actually. We're good? Questions? The other thing you should start to think about are other hormones that aren't on the stats that will affect the stats.
How does the body know you're done with puberty? I'm thinking of the people who don't have any testosterone receptors. You said they're really tall.
Wait, say that again?
The individuals, the XY individuals with no testosterone receptors, so they look X, so they look female.
But that's all estradiol.
Okay.
So in people who are AIS, who are totally androgen insensitivity syndrome, the growth is stimulated by estradiol. So in men, it's the conversion of androgen to estrogen. Testosterone doesn't do a whole lot on its own. So in men, it's the conversion of testosterone to estrogen that stimulates the growth axis. In women, it's the estrogen directly from the ovary. And the same as in the bone, it's not testosterone in men, it's testosterone converted into estrogen in the bone. In men, that stimulates the calcification and it stimulates the growth plate fusion.
But in those individuals, how does it know when to calcify?
Because that's estrogen dependent. So in those individuals that have no androgen receptor, they still have they still make an androgen, they just don't respond to it, and they still have aromatase that's converted to estrogen in the bone, just like any man would, or female. And so the estrogen still causes the bone, the fusion at the growth plate. Does that make sense?
I think I'm just confused about what the signal could be, because it doesn't seem like they ever quote unquote go through puberty in the traditional sense.
Well, they don't go through they don't experience that androgen sensitive thing because they don't have androgen receptor. So their genitalia doesn't grow, so they don't develop facial hair, they don't develop pubic hair, they don't get acne because they don't have androgen receptor. But the growth is because androgen is converted into estrogen. And the lean muscle is because the androgen is blocking the cortisol receptor. It's not directly, there may be some anabolic effects of androgens, but the main thing it's doing, or one of the main things it's doing, is blocking the cortisol receptor. So they still have lean muscle, they just don't have androgen-dependent features. They don't have a deep voice. They would have female-type distribution of fat because they don't have androgen receptors. So they don't have the trunk androgen receptors. Yeah.
Do changes in estrogen levels during the menstrual cycle affect growth rate?
So that's a good question. So the question is whether or not changes in estrogen levels affect calcium laydown. That's one of the big questions about somebody who's on a progestin-only pill for a long period of time. Because you have very limited exposure, or fairly limited exposure to estrogen if you're on a progestin-only pill. But if you're asking, do your bones get weak? I mean, change. I don't think there's that much of a drastic change in estrogen. Like there's a base level of estrogen that maintains the bone. I think there's certainly changes during pregnancy because of the hormones, but also because remember you're growing a whole new skeleton. So there are changes in pregnancy that make more calcium. In fact, it used to be said that you lose a tooth for every pregnancy. Like women lose calcium from their teeth, and actually my mom did. But back in the day when there wasn't vitamin D and calcium in milk and all that stuff, that wasn't the case. So during pregnancy you could, but that's in part because you're growing a new skeleton. Yeah.
Could you just clarify again with estrogen? It's stimulating the bone growth via growth hormone, and
So-
that would be the plate, right?
It does both. So the growth spurt, the one that comes at adrenarche, if you experience adrenarche, was because androgens like androstenedione from the adrenal gland were converted into estrogen that stimulated a growth hormone increase. Okay. At puberty, it's estrogen from the ovary and testosterone converted to estrogen in men that stimulates the growth hormone axis. So you get increased linear growth. At the same time, it's estrogen that causes the calcification and fusion of the growth plate so that you stop growth. In fact, I think a couple years ago, we gave a paper, there was a couple that had, I think, a little girl with Down syndrome. And they were petitioning the courts to inject her with estrogen so that they could stop her from growing so she'd be easier to move around and things. So it's a big controversial case. So estrogen does both. It stimulates linear growth, but it also shuts it off.
What is the mechanism for the fusion?
It's the same as the way it's stimulating the calcium laying down by stimulating the osteoblast and inhibiting the osteoclast. But if you're asking why it happens at a certain time in some people and not others, I have no idea. That's the same question as why puberty starts later or sooner. It's just different in different people. Yeah.
Do you think it's because the difference of it?
The what?
Is it driven by the amount of estrogen?
I don't know. I don't know that there's any evidence. No, because I don't think. No, because it still happens in different people. I mean, some people, my wife stopped growing when she was 14. I know people grew when they were in their mid-20s. So there's just maybe it has to do with the number of receptors or some other. You have questions? All right. The other thing you should start to think about are other hormones that impact this. Cortisol can have a big impact, for example. Cortisol and its catabolic effects. So in the same way we talked about with the glucostat, that there are lots of other hormones that aren't regulated by glucose, but that affect intermediate metabolism. We talked about growth hormone, we talked about prolactin, we talked about IGF-1, we talked about thyroid hormone, we talked about cortisol, we talked about epinephrine, that all affect intermediate metabolism, even though they're not regulated by glucose itself. And we also talked about estrogen and androgen's ability and cortisol to shift where you store fat. We talked about in the osmostat, we talked about cortisol, but you need to think about other hormones that might affect the osmostat, other conditions that might affect osmoregulation. When I say think about it for next Thursday. And think about the same thing for calcium. For example, cortisol, because of its proteolytic for protein catabolism, cortisol can have a big impact under extreme stress because of its catabolic effects on your bone's ability to store calcium. All right, so we're going to talk about for the rest of the course, for the rest of the life cycle, is how to integrate your axes with your stats. And also, now that we've built this person, we're going to talk about carrying them down. Because basically, as you age, everything we talked about, for whatever reason, some of which we know, some of which we don't, starts to fail. In women, for example, in the same way that menarche is the start of your menses, menopause is the end of your menses, and it's usually preceded by a series of irregular periods until eventually you don't get them anymore. Nobody knows what causes it, but it's a failure of the ovaries. And it's interesting, rats experience menopause, but the hypothalamus and pituitary fail in rats. In humans, the ovaries fail. It's not because you run out of eggs. I know you've heard that in some other places. You still have plenty of eggs when you go through menopause, but the follicles stop responding to LH and FSH. In general, in the absence of negative feedback, as you reach menopause, there's an increase in the GnRH pulse frequency. That results in increased LH because there's no feedback, the ovaries aren't responding. And relatively speaking, big increases in FSH. Who knows why that is? Relative to premenopausal, you have much higher FSH levels. Who knows why? Based on something I just told you 5 minutes ago. Yeah. There's no inhibin, so as the follicles stop responding, there's no inhibin, so not only does LH go up and FSH goes up, but FSH goes up even more because there's no inhibin. So much lower levels of inhibin. Low levels of progesterone and estrogen. The consequences of that are decreased fertility. For example, it's a big problem for people like us. As you go to school, you go to grad school, you go to med school, you put off having babies for a long time. It's very unlikely that you can have a successful pregnancy after 50. Actually, I know somebody who almost did. She was 48. Well, that's pushing it. If you're a woman. If you're a man, we're good. We'll talk about that later. The oldest father on record is 90 years old. I don't know why I said mammary size, it just hit breast size. So there's a decrease in the size of the breast, there's a big decrease in the size of the uterus. Decreased libido. Increased vaginal dryness. There's an increase in the risk of heart disease and atherosclerosis, which I can't spell. I'm just gonna say artery hardening. You guys know, if you guys know how to spell it, spell it. Atherosclerosis. There's some problems with thermal regulation. Women who go through menopause have what are called hot flashes, where they feel like the temperature is changing in their upper chest. And I don't know that anybody knows what it is, but there's some idea that the part of the hypothalamus that controls thermal regulation, somebody who knows brains like my GSIs, tell me if I'm making this up, that the part of the hypothalamus that controls thermal regulation, it's been described as goes through estrogen withdrawal. And so in the absence of estrogen, you don't regulate temperature properly. Is that what you heard?
I've never heard.
Okay, that must be right. And you look at it like you're getting ready to call BS on me. And there's an increase in bone loss for all the reasons that we just discussed. It used to be, wait, am I forgetting anything? It used to be that people would describe something called HRT, hormone replacement therapy. I think up until last year, there were still people, every year the data changed, but there were still people studying whether or not giving hormone replacement therapy or estrogen to women in menopause to save the bone was more beneficial than the risk of breast and uterine cancer, which we're going to talk all about on Tuesday and Thursday. So the remedy used to be hormone replacement therapy because once you reach menopause and estrogen goes down, like 30 years ago, they used to give you these calcium supplements, but it turns out that doesn't help very much at all. So once you go through menopause and you're losing calcium from the bone, giving more calcium doesn't help. It's the missing estrogen because of all those things we talked about. The increased rankle, the decreased osteoprotegerin, the decreased facile, the increase in the life of the osteoclast. That's what's causing you to lose calcium from the bone. It's not that you don't have calcium in your diet. So your bone health, like right now, your bone health and that you get the right amount of calcium now is much more important than what you can do after menopause. So now's the time you should be thinking about it. As of last year, I think the latest studies showed that the risk of breast cancer and uterine cancer were much higher than the benefits of giving HRT for bone stuff. All right, so I'm gonna stop there. I guess tomorrow's a holiday, so what I'll do is on Friday, 8:30 to 9:30, we'll post that on your thing. And then on Thursday, I'll have off hours again, regular time next week on Wednesday. And on Thursday, I'll try to stop early enough so we can have review sessions. You guys must do better on the next midterm. Otherwise, I don't know what to do. Count them. I did what I can. All right, I'll see you guys later.